So before we get to the question time section itself, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Fiona Bruce. No, I'm kidding. I'm Kathleen MacDonald and I work for Community Energy Scotland. I cover the Western Isles and I've been working with community projects on energy efficiency, micro renewables, larger scale renewable projects and also sustainability projects. So a wide range of things over a number of years now and a very interesting role. Community Energy Scotland, we're a registered charity with over 400 members throughout Scotland. So we're a membership-based organisation and we're always interested in what our members are needing and require from us. Our mission is to strengthen and empower local communities by helping them to own, control and benefit from their local renewable energy resources, control and reduce their energy costs, regenerate their communities and play their part in the low carbon transition. So we're kept very busy. I'm sure you're all very aware of this, but I thought it would be good to have a bit of context on the Outer Hebrides. We have significant community power, and I don't just mean community renewable power, I mean determined and dedicated community groups that are constantly trying to improve their situation and become more sustainable, and they're an inspiration, I think, for us all. We also have strong ties with the land and community land ownership and are proud of the level of community land ownership we have, but also that the communities in areas where there isn't land ownership are also taking up lots of land management projects. We're resource rich. We have lots of renewable energy potential, but we're still fuel poor. So I think that's fair to say there's been a bit of a failure of policy there, and that we're hoping today can be a start of opening up that discussion and how we can improve that situation. So this week we've had lots of various themes and it really has highlighted to me how wide a topic climate change is and how many different topics there are within each theme. So I'm just going to run through these. There's such big points and probably need different sessions for each one, but so I'm just going to summarize the key points. And if there's any I've missed, please feel free to highlight them in the discussion session. So we've looked at the environment, transport, energy, land use, and action. So in terms of environment, there's been a lot on protecting, whether it's MacNeil or vulnerable areas, coastal protection. We had an interesting discussion with North East on the need for dedicated community rangers across the Isles. So looking at having that strong linkage between each area, looking at how we can support environmental projects. Improved access for all to avoid lots of different access points. Also looking at additional tourism to avoid roaming. Support and endorse biodiversity, and adaptation is essential as well. Looking at how historical carbon is impacting on us now. Transport, we need more support for paths and active travel. Improved public transport linkages to low carbon travel options. So that was looking at not just whether public transport options could be increased, but whether the timing of them and making sure that they link up more sensibly with what community hubs are doing. So community hubs throughout the islands looking at low carbon transport initiatives seems like that's something that's definitely on the agenda, including car sharing and e-bikes. And a theme of all the sessions has been the positive impact that climate sustainability projects can have on our health and well-being. In terms of energy, that's the area I suppose we've been most involved in a number of years, and there's there's a lot that needs to happen in terms of flexibility and smarter grid networks. So being cleverer with what we have and trying to, or making sure that communities are at the heart of that, because they've already got resource or they are planning renewable projects, which is where localized energy solutions come in. Also looking at whether there's community energy subsidy and support schemes that can be provided. That would be a small dent on the government pot, but a massive impact on communities throughout Scotland. Off-gem regulations, looking at future proofing, and again that comes back to things like cable failures, and we've experienced a lot of that in recent times. Transmission charging, electricity prices, highest in the UK. There's so much to talk about. The local electricity bill, fuel poverty is still a serious issue. So it's just so important. It's always there, and I feel like sometimes we get used to the fact that it's there, and that's not a good place to be. And with things with fuel prices increasing, it's becoming more of an issue. And then land use, so local growing projects, communities are really interested and involved in community growing, and that's increasing, and there's a need for support to be able to encourage that to grow, pun intended, and maintained as well. Crofting was another of our sessions, and that was actually our most popular session, crofting and peatland. And there was lots of discussion and useful points that came from that. So looking at the benefits to our ecosystems and local produce, and also the looking at peatland restoration and tree planting. And there was discussion over carbon credits and offsetting, and needing to just really carefully think through how that impacts on community groups and communities in general, and what the benefits versus the sort of issues are around that. And just to summarize a few points that I couldn't fit into the themes, I think, and it runs across a lot of the theme. Policy really needs to take in rural communities, and I'm sure both the representatives have argued this over a long period of time, but taking rural communities into account so that there's different policy for rural communities, because they are different, whether it comes to the level, the distances we have to travel compared to the sort of looking at our houses and how they are ventilated. There's lots of different things that change when it comes to a rural situation. There's also the Island Centre for Net Zero, and we're seeing that as a potential key resource for our islands in the future, but really need to argue for that, for communities to be at the heart of the decision making there. And ourselves at CES are speaking with the council about that too, but it could be a real opportunity through the island deal. The easiest option isn't always the best, and I think communities, anyone who's developed definitely a renewable project in the past, it's not been easy, but it was the best option in the end. Community ownership and control is always the right way. I'm biased, but I really do feel that it is the best way to move forward. And the final point was just the focus that there needs to be kind of a change in focus, looking at communities being at the centre of policy. I feel like that's changed over the last few years, and we need to revisit that. One of the sessions we had, there was someone mentioned, they were asking about their project. It was a growing project, and how they were able to start it off and get the project developed to a point where it was successful. And they talked about their community board and management as being their North Star. I just thought, that our communities should really be the government's North Star, because they know what's happening on the ground. They're aware of the different issues, the challenges, the opportunities. And so it's just opening up the discussion today to see how we can help facilitate that a bit more. So I will now stop talking, which is great because I'm not a fan of my own voice, and hand over to someone else. So I was a bit too keen to put my slides down actually, because I have one more to introduce the speakers, but wait a second. I was too excited to stop talking there. I will put it back up. So there we go. I'm delighted to have Alasdair Allan and Angus Brendan MacNeil with us today. And just a bit of an introduction. I'm sure they need no introduction considering how long I'm seeing that Alasdair's been in post since 2007 and Angus since 2005. So they know exactly the issues I've been talking about, I'm sure. But Alasdair Allan has been the MSP representing the constituency since 2007. He graduated from University of Glasgow with an MA in Scottish Language and Literature and then a PhD in Scots Language from the University of Aberdeen. He's currently a member of both the Rural Affairs, Islands and Natural Environment and the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee. These committees really don't roll off the tongue, do they? So thanks, Alasdair, for coming along today. And Angus Brendan MacNeil is also here, was elected MP for h-Eileanan in 2005. In 2015, he was elected chair of the Energy and Climate Committee until it was dissolved in 2016. And in 2016, he was elected as the first ever chair of the International Trade Committee and re-elected in 2020. But during his time in Parliament, he has served as spokesperson on a number of issues, including transport, foreign affairs and environment, food and rural affairs. So plenty experience and knowledge for us all to kind of discuss some of the key points on climate change. So I thought it would be quite good before we open it up for questions, just to hear a bit more on what both Alasdair and Angus Brendan have been seeing from the government point of view as our representatives in there, and what changes they're seeing in terms of climate change policy, but also where there might be areas where we could work together to improve things for communities. So I've been told that in alphabetical order is best, so I'm going to hand over to Alasdair Allan first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for the invite to be here. And I suspect I'll tell you lots of things that you already know and you've already been talking about throughout the course of today. So it's probably more useful to hear your views and try and come in on them. But in terms of where we're at on the environmental debate, I mean, I think everybody can sense that COP26 being in Scotland has definitely shifted the dial of the political debate in Scotland. Probably away now from what we're aiming for and the debate about how we're going to get there. The interesting thing is, of course, and you can see this happening to some extent in the issues that arise politically, is that we're kind of all agreed about what we need in terms of keeping to 1.5, but every time anyone proposes a particular measure to get to that or to keep to that, that's when the controversy begins, and that's when you sometimes see opposition to what's being proposed. So that's the difficult point we're at, and that's where we'll have to keep to stick to our guns on that, I think. In terms of some of the things in no particular order, and you mentioned some of them yourself about where the debate is at or where policy is at. In terms of locally, but nationally as well, I think one of the biggest issues that we're going to have to wrestle with is the housing stock. In the Western Isles, HHP has just been given a big grant to build new houses, and I suspect that new houses will be built to high standards, but there is going to be a real task in terms of retrofitting the housing stock, especially the kind of housing stock we've got in the Western Isles. So that's going to be a challenge for the years ahead, and one we'll really have to start thinking about. I think the point that you've made about being mindful of or involving rural communities is important, and also when it comes down as well to island proofing some of the rules. I was recently dealing with people who pointed out that some UK-wide rules on avoiding condensation in houses involved cutting large holes in windows, which people, unsurprisingly, in the Western Isles were not too happy about. So I think there's lots of things that we need to tackle on the housing front. In terms of energy, we're going to see an increasing demand for electricity over the next few years, which is a good thing, because it means that people are leaving behind petrol cars. It means people are leaving behind other forms of heating, but the demand is going to go up. So we're going to have to be geared up, particularly in the islands where there's a renewable resource to exploit, to make sure that it is exploited. So for instance, one of the things that I'm sure you've talked about is the fact that when we see exploitation of floating wind power or wind power to the west of the Western Isles, that we start to see some of that coming ashore, if you like, or making landfall in the Western Isles. We need to have an interconnector, which, as you know, has been talked about endlessly for years and years, but we need to see that actually happen to make sure that some of the wind projects that are planned for Lewis can happen, for instance. And we also need to have the kind of robust infrastructure for the electricity network that we need, including charging points, of course, which is going to be a huge task for the years ahead. And we also need to start thinking about what we're actually going to do to reduce our contribution to the global problem of rising sea levels, which it may seem that Scotland's contribution is small, but we have to play a role. I was speaking to the Speaker of the Parliament of Tuvalu the other week, when I was not in COP, because MSPs didn't get invited to COP, but when I was at an event in the Scottish Parliament, and the Speaker of the Tuvaluese Parliament was pointing out that his country, which is only got a population of 11,000, already at the highest tide of the year, 40% of his country is covered, but he's now anticipating that to get significantly higher, to the point where people are having to build their houses on large concrete plinths to keep them out of the water. So that's an example of an extreme example, but it does provide parallels with parts of South Uist, parts of Benbecula, where there are houses below sea level at the moment, behind Machars and so on. And we should start, I think, to make common cause with other countries and other places and other island communities. Those are my kind of list of observations about the kind of the challenges that are ahead. The other one I want to mention briefly, though, is food miles. We need to start doing something about that. The committee I'm on, one with a long name, about rural affairs, is looking just now at this very issue, where around Scotland still many public sector institutions like schools and hospitals and prisons are getting their food from a long way away in frozen form. And we probably need to start making sure that contracts for food in the public sector are more aware of food miles and more aware of the local economy, so that we're doing something good for it too. So that's a random series of observations, and happy to answer any questions.
That's great, thanks. I'll maybe pass over to Brendan to give a few of his observations or just overviews of what's been happening on the policy side, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks for the invite as well. I'm not sure that there's a question and answer, but I'm quite interested in, because I think it'll be more question and learning, certainly from my point of view. A bit of trepidation with people who've been dealing with this, particularly for a week of intensity. But one good thing about this is forums like this are happening across the world at the moment, small and large, in all sorts of geographical locations. And I was fortunate enough to get into COP, and it was really an exchange of people, an exchange of ideas, sort of seminars, debates, meetings, just a big exchange going on. But the one thing you really felt about it was there looked to be people from just all corners of the world there. And it's certainly something that's got momentum, it's got people's attention now. And I'm thinking back to a Saudi Arabian oil minister who said the oil age won't end through lack of oil, just as the Stone Age didn't end through lack of stones. And I think people are driving this onwards because we understand things have got to change. We can certainly, as Alasdair was mentioned there on the interconnector, we can certainly play a part here in the Hebrides to help the mainland. And you know, if you look at the energy consumption of the UK at the moment, it's about 40 gigawatts. Today, about 31% of that's from wind. But the point I raised with Boris Johnson at the liaison committee the other week is that the UK is currently taking in 700 megawatts from Belgium, so 690 megawatts from Norway, a gigawatt from the Netherlands. France isn't sending anything today, and I don't know if that's to do with the tweets or anything in the wider politics, but France usually sends something. But the point I was making was, you know, in the Hebrides here, we could be sending to the mainland, as could Shetland, and probably combined, we could match the Netherlands, not far off a gigawatt of energy. But it's cheaper to take renewable energy from an equivalent distance on the European continent than it is to the centre of the UK market than it is from the Hebrides. And that surely is something that's got to be looked at and redesigned, both in our transmission and distribution costs. And I raised those particular points with the Prime Minister last week at the liaison committee. It was sort of a one moment of seriousness we get out of him. He certainly promised to get back and right, which means in Prime Minister sort of speak, I'm not fully aware of the situation. It sounds sensible, but I'm not committing myself to anything at the moment, but I'll try and find out, which is really as good an advance as you can hope to get. At least it wasn't dismissed out of hand. Other things that we've got, I'd probably be preparing for hydrogen here. I know there are companies around that are seeing the potential for hydrogen development. A Canadian company, Northland Power, talking of that in the blocks north and west of Lewis in particular. I think we've lost an opportunity in the last while on carbon capture and storage, which has to be a large part of what could and should have been happening in Scotland. And it's disappointing that didn't happen, given that Scotland could have had a lead in this, going back to the days of Alasdair Allan, who decided not to, going back then to the days of Amber Rudd and Andrea Leadsom when the plug was pulled again. And this is the third time that the plug's been pulled. So it is disappointing. On a local level, Alasdair mentioned the housing. He's absolutely right. Energy efficiency, insulation, air source and air source and ground source heat pumps with lochs and damp ground round about. It's ideal for ground source in many places. And I think, yeah, one thing I would flag up that I discovered recently, and I think this is quite interesting. It was in Al Jazeera actually, that the amount of copper that's been mined by humankind since probably the Bronze Age, when it was first required mixed with tin, is something like 800 million to 1 billion tons of copper. So that's over about 4 or 5 millennia. The estimation of what's required in the next 30 years is the same, another 800 million to 1 billion tons of copper. So the move that is happening to electrification is not without its own set of problems, and that's something to be mindful of as well. And I don't think there are many solutions to that particular set of problems, but just to be aware that in places like Chile, where the main mines are, it isn't without its own difficulties. And the copper pinch is estimated to come on about 2030, 2040 onwards. For all the electrical stuff, because I think it's something like 170 pounds of copper or something incredible that will have to go into each and every electric car on average. So the one thing about problems is though we often have ways of surmounting those problems. It's just being aware of the problems. And I think if we're going to keep within 1.5 degrees and a sea level that's rising, 3.6 millimeters per year, I think is the current estimation. Then it doesn't take very long to add those over a decade. You get 3.5 centimeters and so on. We can still see, we can easily see what's going to go wrong and quite quickly. But again, like Alasdair, I'm here. I think I'm down to be question and answer, but I'm thinking I'm down to be question and learning. So whatever answer I give, the person who asked the question in these kind of forums usually comes in afterwards and educates me. So I'll be looking forward to that particular part. Thank you.
Thanks both for that. That leads very nicely into our question and answer session. And I think really it is a chance for a final discussion from the week. So I'd really like to invite everyone to have a chance to say what their sort of key aims are and anything that we might be able to progress with and take away as actions for this last session. So I'm going to invite John MacDonald, first of all, to ask his question. I've seen that he's put in the chat.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Brilliant. I suppose a question particularly to the two politicians here, particularly Angus. I know your role obviously in international trade, very much focused on business. I think a lot of the issues around net zero and COP are obviously very commercially focused. It's pretty easy to understand how wind turbines could pay for themselves, or indeed parts of the electricity grid. So rather than sort of pursue that line of conversation, I'd just like to take this opportunity to address something I think has perhaps been a little missing in this week, and to my mind, one of the real low-hanging fruits with sustainability. The title of this event here is the opportunity to ask local representatives about their actions or policies to support sustainability in the Western Isles. And I just want to come back to that word sustainability. It's to do with ecology. The word itself entirely references sustainability with regards to ecosystems. And of course, the main ecosystem of natural interest in the Western Isles is indeed the ocean. And that topic has been a little bit missing this week. No fault of the organisers. I think it's perhaps something that we'll focus on more in future years. But I attended an event recently in Leverborough. I live on the Alasdair Allan. I've lived here for several years. We're just about to have a child a week today, so I'm raising the flag. But
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I attended a meeting about marine reserves in Leverborough to be told a really quite a shocking fact to me, which was that there is not one single no-take marine reserve in the whole of Scotland. There are a great many marine reserves that preserve specific parts of specific ecosystems, where, for example, you're not allowed to interfere with dolphins, or you're not allowed to dredge a merle bed, or there are certainly limits in certain areas, but there is not one no-take marine reserve in Scotland. Now, I know with your role as chair of the International Trade Select Committee, you'll have had recent dealings with New Zealand. New Zealand has a policy of 1/3 of their land and 1/3 of their ocean as complete wilderness reserves. I'd like to ask you this simple question. Can we create, or rather, do you believe we should create in Scotland something akin to the New Zealand model, where we preserve 1/3 of our oceans? If that is not a no-take marine reserve, then what is it? Because if you're allowed to fish in a marine reserve, or if you're allowed to mine a marine reserve or dredge a marine reserve, it's not a marine reserve in my understanding of what that word should mean. And if we're going to do that in Scotland, if we're going to have marine reserves, where could possibly be better, as a small child can tell you from looking at a map, than the Western Isles, if you look at our coastline and our ecology? So what I'm saying is, I think there should be a no-take marine reserve in the Western Isles. I think you should get behind that. I'm just going to, again, finish that off by saying, in terms of sustainability, back to that point again, marine ecosystems have an enormous role to play in capturing carbon. We have megafauna in the Western Isles, something that most of the Surrey constituencies of the Conservative Party don't have, but we actually have megafauna here, whales, cetaceans, and they play an enormous role in capturing carbon. So if we're genuinely concerned about sustainability, and not just about producing an economic plan to make someone some money somewhere, I can only think that preserving the marine reserve here is probably the lowest hanging fruit on the tree. Just your views on that, Angus, please, first of all, for me.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, I think the first thing we've definitely got is we've probably got a third, if not a 2/3, no take on the land. If you look on the land, if you fly over the land, it's very little use. But your question is mainly about the marine area. Now, probably if we look at the marine areas vary and change all the time. When the cod of Newfoundland stopped, the lobsters increased dramatically, because the cod was a predator on the lobster. So things vary, and they go into new balances and changes with themselves. Broad Bay in Lewis, I'm assured by the Fishermen's Association, has been a no-take or a no-go for mobile gear for a number of years, and it's a starfish paradise. There's apparently very little biodiversity in there because the ground hasn't been ploughed or shifted. It's something that the fishermen maintain. So it'll be something that you need to look into and examine. The thing is that I feel that certainly there are a lot of areas where you can take and not damage. I'm thinking particularly of a beach in Barra here where we've got cockles, and the cockles have been harvested successfully for 2,000 years, and the cockles have still, not 2,000 years, I know, 200 years, actually probably 2,000 years, and maybe even more. But the cockles are still there, and a harvest of a sustainable harvest was reckoned by scientists to be taken off that when it was examined sometime in the 90s. I'm trying to remember the numbers. The biomass was something like 900 tons, and I know Ewan Scott's on this call, and was meant to be in the Scott, so he might have the numbers a bit more to hand.
You're
and a certain
in the right
biomass
ballpark,
harvested. Sorry, Ewan.
You're in the right ballpark.
And thank you. I'm in the right ballpark. So a sustainable harvest of 200 tons can be taken off a year.
I think, just to kind of come back, I mean, like there was a recent proposal to create an enormous industry from the kelp in the Minch, for example, and I know that's not actually come to pass, but there was a proposal to do an enormous amount of kelp dredging. Now that was in a marine reserve, and that marine reserve was there for the preservation of dolphins. Now the way this kind of thinking tends to work is that dolphins are not going to be interfered with by the dredging of a kelp forest underneath them, because they're primarily able to avoid the equipment and so on. But to think that dolphins themselves are not components of that kelp forest and dependent on that kelp forest. I mean, let me give you another example. Recently, we're blessed to have a UNESCO World Heritage Seabird Colony, as you know, to the west of the Western Isles and the former St Kilda. And actually, there's a proposal which is currently underway to create a recreational fishery for bluefin tuna around that marine reserve. Now, there's about 5% mortality rate, and it'll of course provide some income to the Western Isles. But to imagine that harassing, bluefin tuna around the UNESCO seabird colony, it can, has no ecological impact, let alone the carbon of those jet boats and so on that are going to do that. It's just an example of the classic lack of joined up thinking. I mean, one could say the same about the COP, that we're at 26 COPs now, and no one's actually really talking about leaving all the fossil fuels in the ground and just turning off the fossil fuel tap. It's an incredibly straightforward solution that you could say to a small child. If the bathtub is overflowing, how do you stop the bathtub overflowing? You stop the tap. And so, just to kind of cut through the crap. I mean, it's like, in a way, you'll be familiar in politics, of course, with that famous quote from Bill Clinton's, presidential campaign against George Bush. It's the economy, stupid. Well, to flip it around, it's the ecology. When we're talking about sustainability, it's always just the ecology. There is nothing else. And so really, to have an incredibly simple approach where we just allocate portions of ecosystems, as you rightly point out, the land's doing very well. There's some fantastic work being done on tree planting. I'm not here to talk about that. I'm specifically talking about the lack of joined up ecological thinking in the marine area, which could just be resolved incredibly quickly, as John Muir, that fantastic Scot, did in America, where, through the creation of reserves. And the reserves we've got here aren't worth the paper they're printed on.
Yeah, can I come in on some of that as well, John?
Yeah, you can. I'll just answer a couple of points quickly. And the dredging, the fishermen themselves had a large part in that, because they certainly saw the danger there. On the prawn fishery, there's about 7,000 tons not taken that could still be taken sustainably from the benches, which is
these are the people that wiped out the herring we're talking about here, isn't it?
Well, no, they're different people with respect. I mean, the people who wiped out the herring are no longer fishing. The people who wiped out the herring were in 7,000 tons. I would say that fishermen have come on an awful lot in their understanding as an industry, but certainly they're different people, and they've got families who are also informing them as well. So they're not in a vacuum either. And there was a mention of oil there, but we've got to watch about shocks into the system. I mean, everybody is free to stop using oil tomorrow, or using the products of oil or whatever, but they're going to find themselves in you might not have your electricity going at the moment if that was to happen. If any of us do that, we need to plan, and the whole point at the moment is planning a strategy through this, is to make sure that we manage to take society with us. If we pull a shock in all of a sudden and leave people in dark and cold, is not really an answer either. So we've got to be very aware of how we get to wherever we want to go. But to the original point of the no-take area itself, I mean, if we have a no-take area, what are the economic knock-ons? What's the shocks we're introducing to people there? It's all very well to shout for no-take area. It's not affecting a certain person personally, but the people who will be affected will certainly have a view on that. So I would have to say, John, with respect, that I'd be very reluctant to go to a no-take area, where I also feel and understand that the fisheries around here are quite light anyway. In the west of the Hebrides here, in the west of Barra, where I am right now, nobody can take anything at the moment, because if you were out there, you wouldn't come back. So you've got that sort of going on as well. So, Alasdair, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point I would make, firstly, before I start talking about the sea, John, you remind me of, when you're talking about carbon sinks there, I think you remind me of a point about the land as well. So I'm not avoiding your question about the sea. I'll come back to that in a minute. But one thing I forgot to mention is that when we talk about carbon sinks, of course, the land is a significant carbon sink, and peatland as well. And I think it's important that we remember that trees are not the only way.
No. Yeah.
I know you're not saying that, but I'm just saying,
Yeah.
I think it's important that all of us remember that some of the landscapes we've got in the Highlands and Islands, don't need trees on them. We don't need to plough up.
No, I'm not.
I know you're not suggesting that, but I think it's important that we factor into this debate we're having about carbon sinks. This point, because there is a danger that unless we do that, we'll end up with sort of perverse incentives for some landowners to plough up carbon sinks in order to put trees in. So I think that's an important point, by the by. But your question was about the sea, and what I would say about that is that, as Angus has pointed out, there are on a small scale a few no-take zones. There is going to be a debate about highly protected marine areas, which probably is an example of what I mentioned at the beginning of my comments about where we get into the conflict about the generalities of trying to bring world temperature down and difficult specific local policies. I do think, and I won't make any apologies for saying this, I do think we want to have, and we will need to have, a fishing industry in places like the Western Isles in order for there to be young people. But before you jump in on that, I know you live in Scalpay, so as you point out, we have seen what happened with the herring in years past. But as Angus Brendan points out, we have to find some kind of modus vivendi, some kind of arrangement that works, and some kind of arrangement that respects the fact that fishing in a sustainable form is going to have a future in the islands, where we're in serious trouble. But if I can just finish my point, that will mean things like evidence-based designations. It will mean things like respecting the fact that many fishermen are using or would like to use winch monitors to prove that they're fishing or not fishing, rather, in protected habitats. It means we start having to take some of that maybe more seriously than we have in the past. On your point about kelp, as you say, the particular proposal was knocked back in the end, or didn't happen.
Yeah,
I think there is a sustainable way in which the hand cutting of kelp can seaweed rather can be part of a sustainable industry. But I think the mechanical harvesting that was proposed was ripping up habitat that would be very difficult to replace, and so I think that one was rightly knocked back. So there will be debates about further the restrictions on fishing in some areas, and what those areas are not clear as yet. There will be controversy about it, and it will have to be evidence-based, and that's about the best I can say, but that debate does lie ahead of us.
Yeah, I think I'll have to cut in there just to enable other people to come in and ask questions. I'm seeing that Murdo has raised his hand. I should say,
let me just suggest that we take 2 or 3 questions at a time.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, the other thing is, if you could introduce yourself and just who you represent, that might be useful as well. Thank you. Okay, we've got Murdo and then Ewan, so we'll go to Murdo first.
Hi, Kathleen. Murdo McCritchie. I live up in Ness, so I work in the oil industry, but I kind of commute back and forth from Aberdeen, but I'll try and work as much as I can. I think it was just, it was quite some interesting kind of topic there. I think getting back to some things you spoke about at the start, with fuel poverty and things like that in the island, I think that was really interesting. And with the resources we have in our doorstep here, I I think it's quite phenomenal what we've got here. I think it's quite interesting. You know, if you're talking about the island and what we can do from our own point of view of climate change and things we can measure here, you know, it'd be interesting to see if likes of Angus and Alasdair working with Cornwall, working with the kind of various community groups, Lewis here up in the north of Lewis and Point and Sandwich, various other bodies like that, you know, getting together as a group and maybe starting to kind of map out what some of these things look like. I mean, Angus, you mentioned there about the UK power consumption, you know, generation of 40 gigawatts. You know, it's huge. I suspect that doesn't even account for the kind of, you know, the diesel in our cars or the oil tank I've got out the back of the house here and stuff like that. I think if you start...
That's the grid consumption, yeah, and the electricity.
Aye, so it'll be, that'll be a tiny fraction of the overall energy we need. And I think even as an island, probably there's ways we could measure that, the amount of tankers that arrive in Stornoway. You know, there's very real ways we could measure our consumption as islanders from the Bud to Barra. And I'm just wondering, some of these metrics are helpful for folk to actually measure. You know, I can make a difference by getting rid of that green tank out there. I can make a difference by buying an electric car or something like that. So you solve one problem, but you create another one. And I think some of the points were made there about copper and things like that were really kind of helpful. You know, you solve one problem, you create another. But I think the big problem we're solving just now is obviously the climate change. Sorry, wasn't so much a question, more of a statement more than anything, Kathleen. Sorry.
No, thanks, Murdo. That's interesting. And it does tie in with everything we've had in the week and linking everything together as well. And that's something that we're hoping to take forward because it's such a wide topic. I'll pass over to you next then.
Just picking up on a couple of comments, but at the start, Kathleen, that you outlined the various themes that have been considered this week and added the comment, it's complicated, which indeed it is. Now, my question in part, there's two strands to it, revolves around, have we got a strategic plan or a framework for the Western Isles that seeks to interface these different themes? And by that, I mean that policy tends to be fragmented, and yet we're looking, or we need to look at a whole system approach. So that's the first comment. And the second, though, at the same time, we see national policies being imposed on us, whereas really what we need are local bespoke solutions, because what works nationally doesn't necessarily work locally. And in particular, I would talk about, we've got a fragile electricity network, and the costs of grid reinforcement will probably be prohibitive, and yet there are workarounds if we look at alternative energy vectors. And so that leads into the Hydrogen Action Plan, and I see there's mention of regional hubs, but really, if we want a whole system approach in the Western Isles, we need distributed hubs, and let's call them energy hubs. So it ties in, the overall question is, have we got a strategic approach, and is that whole system? And if not, should we be looking at developing frameworks to achieve the objectives and identify measures required?
Okay, thanks. Pass over. Is it best to take a few questions? We'll take
I just jump in Ewan's there. You know, one of the quarrels I've had with Bees and quasi-Quarthing, and to an extent Richard Harrington before him, and you know, I know the different political parties, but they're actually okay guys to get on with. But one of the problems has been the sort of the policy of, first of all, we know we've mentioned the transmission costs and what have you, but of not realizing we need enough CFDs to make an interconnector happen, for instance. That's been something from a distance. But I think there's something maybe else that Ewan might be touching on, and that's a local sort of thing. We could have local solutions, and interesting local solutions, almost world-leading local solutions with the resources we have around. We've got wind, we've got tidal, we've got wave. Some of those are at infancy. Combine those with a bit of battery storage, be less electricity demanding by air source and wind source, which will give you, for what is it, a kilowatt of energy into a wind source and into an air source heat pump, sorry, will give you something like 2.5 kilowatts back. Going into a ground source will give you 4 kilowatts back. And then, of course, don't forget solar, because we do have very, very long days in the summer. And that is something in the mix that we could have. And the reason I bring that up is the UK government needed 6 gigawatts, they reckon, of base load, and prescribed that to be a nuclear, and the resulting output was Hinkley and the Hinkley Point construction. But and that's at £92.50 per megawatt hour is the sort of the price for that, linked to 2012 prices. There was another group of green power guys who reckoned that they could produce this with that sort of mix that I've sort of mentioned on about £76. But because the 6 gigawatts wasn't just 6 gigawatts, it was prescribed as 6 gigawatts of nuclear, they didn't have a look in to get going. And we know there's many billions would be put forward towards nuclear as a subsidy to the nuclear industry. But I think it would be very interesting if that subsidy had been open to everybody and to let competition go between those, and rather than favouring one, which the government did. I think we could do things here that might be quite interesting. But as Ewan says, we probably need our own decision making here in the islands, the way some other island groups have. But we also would probably need a good deal of finance behind it as well. But the one thing that we do find out about energy is what we consider expensive one day can suddenly be hit by a shock, and say gas prices, and it'll be seen very cheap the next day. And the many an argument I had with the Department of Energy, with Andrea Leadsom and with Amber Rudd over the non-construction of wind, and they were saying it was quite expensive and it might pull on the climate change levy, and it didn't in the end. And now we see that wind is about the cheapest form of energy that we have going, because this marginal cost is effectively zero.
Yeah, I think kind of just leading on from Ian's point on that is that we've got community generators across the islands now who, like say, the Lewis and Harris could be fully powered by community wind, so could North East and South East, and whereas nearly, if they could, they would be able to put more up to enable that as well. So it is looking at how we can use the existing renewables that are there to make best use, so to supply local houses and businesses as well.
If I can come in on that and on the other points there as well, I mean, yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons, as you pointed out or alluded to there, that's one of the reasons why we need to make sure that when we get an interconnector for Lewis, I'm pretty sure that doesn't affect Eust and Barra, but when we get an interconnector for Lewis, that there's actually capacity on it that includes community wind turbines and community producers of electricity, generators of electricity. Otherwise, we run the risk of having to build one cable and then years later coming back to build another one. So I think that leads into the point that Ewan was making about central versus local as well. I mean, obviously I have a frustration politically, but also practically with the fact that the UK government and its agencies put the islands in this sort of catch-22 where we have to prove the demand for an interconnector before you get one, prove the demand from the generators, but then the generators have a disincentive for being interested because there's no interconnector. All of that stuff needs to be redesigned to actually listen to communities, and also to listen to the fact that the only criteria that Ofgem uses cannot simply be the national price of electricity. If the UK and Scotland are all signed up to trying to do energy or produce electricity in a different way, then we have to use other criteria. And of course, related to that point as well is the point that Angus Brendan made about distribution charges, which are completely perverse, which incentivise and pay generators close to London, but actually make you pay the further away from London you are and the nearer you are to the windy places. So it's a system that was designed for the 1950s, when it was assumed that power stations would be run on coal on the edges of big cities, and that you should disincentivize anyone who tried to do anything else. It's not based in the reality that people are generating power now in the northwest of Scotland.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And just a final comment on that is, I think the interconnector has been a challenge for communities for, I'd say, the last 20 years. It's been something that it's hampered development, it's hampered innovation, and it's hampered our ability to be able to enable community projects. And I think that's something that we need to bear in mind as we go forward, because there's still a big question mark over the interconnector. And I totally agree with you that if the interconnector is happening, we definitely want it future-proofed and we want to have space on that cable for community projects. But in the meantime, we do have to focus on other localised solutions as well.
Kathleen, can I just jump in at this point? This is what I will get quite political and critical, because there's a lack of planning goes on. What is left is a sort of a quasi-market with rules set by Ofgem that aren't really the market, but they're sort of perverse rules, one of them of which was mentioned by Alasdair there as well. But if the same rules were required for interconnectors to be built to the European continent, they wouldn't be built. And as we know today, there's about 10% of the UK's energy need coming from the European continent, because there's not this silly hoop jumping happening. There's actually, we need this, let's build it, let's do it. And I don't think there's another government in Europe that would leave the wind resource sitting on the islands that we have here, that left stranded in the way the UK government has left that stranded over a long time now.
A very long time, yeah. Okay, I'll move on. We've got Matthew's got his hand up, and then Kenny, I've noticed as well, also wanted to come in. So if we can go to Matthew first, then Kenny, and then open it up.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, my question, I'll try and be quick. It relates quite a lot to that discussion that's just been had there, and it sort of keep it fairly specific for Angus Brendan. But there is a bill going through Parliament, UK Parliament at the moment, which hopes to make it easier for local supply, the local electricity bill. And there's a debate this Tuesday called Empowering Community Energy Schemes, I think at 2:30 in Westminster. And I just wondered if you were planning on going there, or I know I believe you've supported that bill in the past, but that just seems a great opportunity to really voice that support for looking at more localized solutions, which has been mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. That's short. That bill has been something I've been supporting, you're right, throughout, and it's something, a small debate at Westminster Hall, unfortunately, on Tuesday. And I say unfortunately because things like that should be in the main chamber. Westminster Hall gives it light and education to others who don't know. It's useful, and it hopefully will be elevated soon to be in a chamber debate. And that's what we kind of need to do. There's a lot of there's been an awful lot of argument in and around sort of rural England about this again, getting in the grids as well. And this hopefully is starting to enable it. But it's an old argument as well. It's kind of frustrating because these debates come and go. And they seem, we're locked with Ofgem, to be honest with you, and an awful lot of Ofgem singing. And then when you go to see Ofgem, they say that their remit is set by government. You go back to government and they say, well, we Ofgem are an arm's length body. So you end up sort of nailing jelly to the wall between the two of them, really. And nobody gets this the way the Danes would get this and take it by the scruff of the neck and impose a sort of a policy on it, unfortunately. And the UK has been quite slow. That said, the growth in wind, which has always been despite them, has been heartening over the last decade. I mean, as I was saying today, about a third of the UK's wind resource energy resource is coming from the wind. I think that could have been greater had George Osborne, David Cameron not damaged that growth to an extent back in 2015, 2016, 2017. It may have, in the meantime, recovered, but it was on a better trajectory, I'm pretty certain, had it not been for them at the time. And it wouldn't have cost them anymore. All that was required was to give the security that if things went really wrong to developers, that there was a fallback. And there was actually no need for the fallback.
Okay, thanks. I missed whether you're able to go on Tuesday or not.
I'm not certain. I'm looking at my Tuesday diary, but I've been to a number of these, so I might be there, I might not be there. It depends on, as I said, it's Westminster Hall. That's the downside of it. It's not a chamber debate.
It's a good chance for me to come in with my question time. I want a yes or a no answer.
Maybe.
Okay, that probably fits with question time as well. Moving on to Kenny.
Can I make another point about these debates and about Westminster? Since we stopped doing this sort of forum at Westminster, I've looked into how much carbon it's costing to send probably most of Scotland's MPs, but certainly it's a quarter ton of carbon each and every week to go up and down to Westminster for an individual such as myself, it's probably just a little less than a quarter ton of carbon for the rest of the Scottish MPs. Maybe Alasdair, Carmichael and Chettle will be the same as me. And some of these debates could and should be happening online, and that's something that Jacob Rees-Mogg lost in the 18th century, who loves in terms of carbon, Victorian coal style into the atmosphere, is probably responsible for.
Yeah, well, I think just to finish on that point, I think from the community's point of view, we really do want to see this local electricity bill. It's a really important issue for us, and it looks at local energy supply and how we can be sensible with energy. So in terms of climate change, everything really does go back to localization and being as local as we possibly can, and that local electricity bill would support that. So just to finish on that point, and we'll move on to Kenny.
There was a reason to just debating this from Ben Lake of Plaid Cymru. It was an adjournment debate, which was similar. It was a no vote debate. Ben was good enough to give us a mention here in the h-Eileanan year on the community energy stuff. So just to let you know.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen, for letting me in. First of all, I think it's worth congratulating Community Energy Scotland on an excellent week of debates. I've attended a couple of them, but what is coming through from my point of view is, and Angus Brendan touched on this in his previous talk, was the need for some kind of joined up thinking and a whole system approach. And you and Scott touched on it as well. We're talking about Ofgem, we're talking about grid connection, we're talking about this, that, and the next thing. And there doesn't seem to be an overarching body or forum or whatever it takes to pull all these things together. I chair Carway State Trust. We are sitting on the edge of an offshore wind, a very big offshore wind potential on area N4, which is an area of seabed that has been issued by Crown Estate. Now, Crown Estate have done no communication or whatever with how the power from N4 is going to get to where it's meant to go to. And this is again where if we have an interconnector that has capacity to take N4, then there's a potential to take the power from N4 and N2 and 3, which is further north and west of us, through Western Isles, which has a community benefit for Western Isles. So really what I'm trying to say is that we need some kind of overarching forum so that all these organizations are talking to each other to get maximum benefit for Western Isles. On another point altogether, I attended a meeting last night, which was to do with tourism. And there was 5-6 huge projects, and I'm talking multi-million-pound projects being discussed in the Western Isles. Now, each one of these organizations is fighting their own corner. And the same is true of renewables. Everyone's fighting their own corner. There has to be an overarching forum that takes everything together, pulls everything together, makes decisions, and puts things in order so that things happen in regularity through the Western Isles. And just following on from that, and I'll direct this one to Alasdair Allan. We and many other community organizations throughout these islands employ development officers that are funded through h-Eileanan. h-Eileanan have said to us that we will not get a decision on development officer funding until January, February, or March for the year coming 2022, I should say, because the money hasn't come to h-Eileanan from Scottish Government, is what we have been told. So what I'm wanting to do is to press Alan on that point to make sure that that funding is made available to these. And there's a direct link between these development officers and what we're talking about today to take these things forward as well. But just a few things there to throw into the mix.
If I can come in on that, in that case, first on the question about Matthew, I think that was really addressed to Angus Brendan about legislation in Westminster. In terms of your own point, Kenny, I do sympathise with some of what you're saying, or a lot of what you're saying, in fact, about lack of coordination. I mean, I think at a national level, by which I mean at a Scottish level, I think there is an effort through committee or subcommittees of the Cabinet to actually try and draw departmental activity together, because the Scottish Government has realised quite what is going to be involved in meeting our own pretty ambitious carbon targets, and that will require departments and agencies to work together, frankly, better than they have been doing till present. In terms of your point about development officers and HIE and HIE's budget, if you're okay with that, me doing this, I will happily take that up on your own behalf with government, if you'd like me to do that, and I'll certainly press them on the point you've just made, because obviously you can't make plans as an organisation without some kind of assurance about those development officers being in place. So I'll happily get in touch with you and follow that one up if you're amenable to me doing that. On some of the issues about the division between who's doing what, I mean, you won't be too surprised to hear me say that I find it very frustrating that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have any legislative power over the issue of energy, and therefore a lot of our role is limited to lobbying the UK government to do the right thing. But I mean, putting that political but nonetheless heartfelt point to one side, I think a lot of the frustration arises from the fact that, although, to be fair, the UK government has done a lot of good things on the environment, the way policy on energy is set up is that it is still very much focused on setting the national price of electricity rather than looking at how electricity is produced and where it's produced. And that leads us into the kind of catch-22 situations that we've been talking about, some of them. So I think there is a need for more joined up working. As I say, within government, I think there's more of that going on now, certainly at Holyrood. But what there needs to be is better coordination with communities. And I think that leads into the point that you've made about your own community, which I'm happy to follow up and keep in touch with you about.
Can I jump in there briefly as well, Kathleen? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, again, Kids making a point that needs to be reiterated several times, the whole system approach. At the moment, it's a component approach. It's almost like looking at a motor car and looking at the starter motor and saying, you only use this for about half a second in the journey, let's get rid of it. And then you find out that that's kind of a vital component. Similarly, in the energy stuff, I mean, for instance, the last CFD round should not have happened the way it happened. Imagine giving 250 megawatts of CFDs into the Hebrides and not having the simultaneous knowledge that that wasn't enough, that they were then going to be stranded CFDs. And that's what the UK government managed to do. And I had a sit-down meeting with Kwasi Kwarteng about that. I pointed this out to him. He gets it. He said, you hope it wouldn't happen again. But he says, that's the way the game is set up. Now, they try and present this as some sort of market stuff. It's not a market. It's kind of worse than the market. It's a quasi-market. Pardon, that was a pun. It was unintended. It's a market that's created by the rules of the UK government with a single focus on price to the consumer today, not price to the consumer in the future. Now, if even that was to change slightly, you had different outcomes, because rather than being reliant on Russian gas, you might have thought that getting more than up to 400 megawatts out of the Hebrides might have been a better idea. But no, the price was a little bit higher on one of the bids, and that left 250 megawatts stranded. So I think, you know, if areas as Kenny mentioned, IN4 and 2 and N3 are coming in, and you're only concentrating on one, and then the other two come on, and you built a cable. I think Alasdair mentioned before as well. We don't have a whole system approach. We've got a component approach. We've got something that's blind to the future as well, and only stimulated by present requirements, whether that be price or whether that be construction, and then ignoring the fact that other construction might come on, whether it be those big blocks by whoever or smaller places by communities. And that's a definite frustration that we've got. And we need some sort of overarching forum or body or whatever that has an eye not just on the present and some of those inputs and stimuli that they're getting, but towards the future as well, and what we expect to start happening. We've got to use intelligence, all sorts of intelligence into that, and not play blind to the future, which is unfortunately what's happening at the moment, the way the systems are set up, particularly Ofgem.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say about Ofgem, and all roads seem to lead back to Ofgem in that discussion. And I think that's something that we've that's been raised at a meeting. We had a grid related meeting last week, and whether we need to set up a Western Isles forum on, well, it was on grid, it would be a grid forum with SSEN, but having Ofgem in on that meeting as well, because that's been happening in the past, but it's not been happening for the past few years, and that would be something that we could have as a rolling chair, so it's not set up by one organisation. It used to be the council, but I feel like it would be quite useful to have the council, HIE, ourselves, and the community power Outer Hebrides, so the community groups, all involved and able to chair that session. So I think that is an action for us on the West.
I think that's a good idea, Kathleen. I'm happy to be involved if it's helpful to be involved.
One thing to understand about Ofgem is when they were set up, the remit was given as a market regulator, not as a climate proofer or as a future planner, but as a market regulator for there and then, which is the frustrations that Kenny was highlighting there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or discussion points? John? Yep.
I missed an earlier meeting this week on peatlands. I had a maternity appointment in Stornoway that was sadly more important. But I know we're potentially facing, it was mentioned earlier on about the trees and peat issue. We're potentially facing an economic input by virtue of our ability to capture carbon in the form of peatland in the Western Isles, which I suppose is good. It was mentioned at an earlier meeting this week that that was a good thing for peat, because the only way we could possibly pay the large bill necessary to restore peatland was to sell the carbon credits that the peatland could afford us in order to pay for that refurbishment. I think if we've learned anything from COVID, it's that suddenly if we realise we want to do something, we can just find a way of paying for it without necessarily the previous economic thinking. What my point was just that surely to restore peatland and potentially to restore peatland, we don't need to sell pollution permits to do that. We could potentially just pay for the restoration of peatland because it's a good idea. And I just have a slight concern that the Western Isles might go from being an ecologically good place, as we all believe it is, I'm sure, to potentially less so if we use the natural capital of the Western Isles to essentially flog pollution permits, which don't sound great to me. That was my point.
Anyone wanting to come in on that? The two of you are usually diving in first.
I honestly, I'm not sure I can add much to that other than to say that, yeah, I mean, peatland re-wetting and the blocking of burns and so forth. I mean, there is some sort of small scale activity. I think there's been some more projects, short-term projects on the west side of Lewis. I might be corrected in that by Kenny, but I've heard tell of them anyway. There's probably scope for a lot more of that, but I don't know much about the other point you're raising, John, but certainly, we should be aiming as a country, to do the right things rather than just trade in permits. Yeah.
Although the one thing I would say that if money was coming in, and I asked the chair of the Carloway Community Estate Trust if he could do anything with his money that was coming in for the good of Carloway and the planet, I'm sure that Kenny could think of something to do with the money. I mean, there's a tension there, John.
Yeah, I'd love to see literally Carlisle Community Trust or North Harris Trust claim their carbon credits and actually rip them up. Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy argument to sell, I'll give you that. I wouldn't be in politics at all with that argument. But that's the only ecological good idea there is, really. If you take, for example, Drax, we now have a situation where it receives £1 billion in subsidies a year to burn 1.5 times the entire UK timber production by virtue of burning swamp forests from the east coast of America, and that's considered to be good for the planet. And it's that kind of lack of
Virginia, I think,
yeah, that kind of lack of thinking really is just symptomatic.
I think Kenny wants in, does it?
Yeah, I'm anxious to see if Kenny wants them the money or not. So I'm just going to see.
I hope Kenny does.
Yeah, we always want the money, but and there's numerous projects that we could do with finance like that. But I think we have to tread extremely cautiously on these carbon credit stuff that's coming to the fore just now. And Ben had a very good session on this yesterday, I think it was.
Yes, I think
It was peatland restoration. And we have carried out some peatland restoration on Carway Estate, and it's a very, very interesting project, and it's not at all what people think. And there was a very good description yesterday, and I classify myself as one of these enthusiastic peat cutters.
Yeah.
And I'm also an enthusiastic crofter, and both of these things run together with common grazings and peatland, and grazing and crofting. And again, it's the working together element of all of these things. But with carbon credits, it's a new thing that's coming at us. There's a potential for making money, but we have to tread extremely cautiously, I would say, in just jumping at that. It's not right, it's not ethically right that we would be taking money just from a big multinational that still continues to pump thousands of CO2 into the atmosphere and doesn't do anything about the source of the carbon. They just pay for carrying on doing what they're doing, and to pay us for having peat. So there is a bit of something, and I would say we just tread cautiously on that one.
I should declare a similar interest that I too cut peat, but as they say, it's for my own use.
Yes,
a
likewise,
fantastic
likewise,
sustainable
Alan.
activity. Yeah.
You're a brave man, Alasdair Allan. You're a brave man.
A lot of enthusiastic peat cutters here then. Yeah, okay, I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll move on to Michael's got his hand up, and I've seen your comment, Ewan, and I think I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, thanks, Michael.
Yeah, Michael Hunter from the North Harris Trust. Yeah, I suppose just I'd probably like to echo what others have said there. Also a peat cutter. The joint up thinking aspect that we've touched on already there, and along with peat, trees, marine, hopefully energy, possibly housing as well. But Nature Scot have released yesterday a bit of new information on the Nature Restoration Fund, which is a £10 million fund for various projects throughout the country. North Harris Trust are actually a beneficiary of this fund. Coast Clean, Outer Hebrides are also a beneficiary. The only two in the Western Isles, I think. So that certainly shows a very new way of doing things. It's extremely flexible. It's funding projects based on their merits in ways that might not otherwise have fit funds in the past that require tick boxes to be ticked, and certain stipulations to be met. You know, we're working very much with our local crofting community, with traditional land use patterns, that otherwise you just really wouldn't be able to do. So I suppose the question for yourselves is, we've talked about Ofgem, you know, can a similar body with more flexible ways and means, less restrictions on how it's constituted, that it must regulate, for example, you know, do something about the energy situation? Could a similar body coming from the Scottish Government deal with a housing crisis? I mean, the same thing needs to be done in England and Wales. You know, is there flexibility there to spend money in a way that's joined up, that works, that gives local solutions to local problems? I think that's what we need in every aspect of our society. Not just it's really positive. You know, I don't want to be too negative with this. It is positive that we're seeing this from Nature Scot. So obviously, it's possible. It's possible to be flexible with our funding, with our public funding. So yeah, what's your opinions on that possibility?
On the first point, Michael, I think yeah, certainly Ofgem could be a lot more effective, and it could be a lot more proactive in trying to find solutions. Obviously, as you appreciate, the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament is legally prevented by the 1998 Scotland Act from going anywhere near Ofgem. We're just not allowed to legislate on it. which is a whole frustration in itself. But in terms of housing, which is devolved, there are a lot of things happening, it should be said, on housing in the islands just now, in the sense that there's Scottish Government's just given £45 million to the Corga and to HHP, and there's a lively local debate about how and where that should best be spent. But I mean, just this morning, for instance, I had somebody in touch describing a situation of homelessness, which was pretty shocking, you know, and people have raised, you know, big questions about areas of the islands where there simply is no social rented housing to rent. So that there's huge issues around housing, but we need to make sure we get it right locally, and that we don't just build houses in the easy places to build houses. But there's a whole other question, as I said at the beginning, about retrofitting housing stock. I mean, for instance, again, I'm telling things to people that we already know, but in the Western Isles, we have this very unusual situation where there are lots of people who are living in houses which they own, which their parents have built with their own hands probably, but they don't own the land underneath. And that creates significant problems for people who are trying to either retrofit houses with different forms of heating. The other thing that we haven't talked about, the other main disincentive that I'm picking up in people's minds about doing the right thing and moving away from oil to electricity, is an uncertainty in people's minds about what the unit price of electricity might be in the future. Because of course there were people who moved from coal or peat to oil at a time when the oil price was very low, and then we're concerned afterwards. So I think there's a job of reassurance, and more than reassurance, still needing to be done to make sure that people aren't just exhorted to move to electricity, but there's some reassurance there about what the ongoing costs of that are going to be, and that we get that right.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm conscious of time, so going to try. I'm seeing Angus Brendan has to leave soon as well, so thank you everyone for your contributions. I'm going to just read out Vanessa's point in the chat. 46 billion needed to restore Scottish peatlands, we are told. 250 million over 10 years, a drop in the ocean. Healthy peatlands are essential for the future and good management of them. Ethical thinking rather than commercial payoffs, please. So that's just another kind of point on peatlands and how we have to tread carefully on how that's all going to be managed, and having the community at the forefront of these discussions as well.
And maybe not getting Shell to pay for it.
Yes.
Well, we are going to need to get the private sector to pay for some of it, and landowners to pay for some of it, because
well,
the Scottish Government doesn't have any borrowing power, so we don't have £6 billion. I mean, and the government will certainly contribute, and I take the point that, you know, it may well be a drop in the ocean, but I think one of the lessons that comes out of COP is that government can do a certain amount, but the private sector has to do a lot too.
But a lot of lessons came from COVID.
And just kind of try and wrap up. Sorry, everyone.
Thank you.
Lots of interesting discussion. I think that the key point, I think, is that there is so much that needs done on climate change and community sustainability, that we need to take this whole system approach. We need to, and that comes back to Ewan's comment in the chat, and looking at an overarching framework for the Western Isles. We've got the Outer Hebrides climate change working group, which may be a vehicle for that, but at the moment there's no capacity on that, or a worker who's able to sort of develop projects or even look at an action plan. So I think that's one key point to take away from this, that we really need that group, which encompasses the whole of the Western Isles, to have the resource to be able to progress some of these points. And I think, you know, us as CES would be happy to be involved in that. But again, it does come down to resource and having more time and ability and skills to be able to do that. So some key things to take away, and I do want to say thank you to the speakers and to everyone who's contributed, not just today but over the whole week. They should definitely watch this space. There's so much to do, but I think I'd like to see everyone go away with some inspiration on how we can kick things off and start really progressing these big questions. And they're big juicy questions that need a lot of joined up thinking. So thanks again to everyone, and we'll be in touch, I'm sure. And thanks, Alasdair. I think Angus Brendan's already had to leave, but we do appreciate both your time, and I'm sure we'll be in touch with you both after as well. Thank you.
Very welcome.
Okay.
And thanks very much for chairing today, Kathleen.
Thank you all.